we have already talked about the evolution of the circulatory system, where we saw how in animals, in the original animals, actually wasn't even present. Some animals nowadays, well, they still don't have a circulatory system. Then it quickly evolved first as an open system, not very efficient, still doing its job, and then evolved into a closed circuit, which then became dual with the separation of the systemic and the pulmonary circulatory system. Then we talked about the heart, the structure of the heart, how it works, and how the contraction is organized and how it moves the blood through the right side, the left side, bringing the blood from the right side to the pulmonary system, back to the heart, left side, to the rest of the body, and back to the right side. What we're going to be talking about now is how is that blood that is pumped by the heart now delivered to the lungs and the rest of the body, and how is the overall pressure of the blood regulated in living organism. We'll also talk also about the lymphatic system. So talking about the delivery of the blood. So now you have the blood that is pumped through the heart and is delivered to the lungs, through the pulmonary system, or the rest of the body through the systemic system. And this is done by different type of vessels. So arteries in general refer to those vessels that carry the blood away from the heart. It doesn't have anything to see with the fact whether it's oxygenated or not. It's true, the blood coming out from the heart going into the systemic circulation is carried by arteries and it's oxygenated. But the blood that comes out from the from the right side of the heart and goes into the pulmonary system is actually carried by arteries, but it's not oxygenated. So arteries are just those vessels that take the blood away from the heart, bringing it either to the lungs or the rest of the body. Now, arteries, they slowly, so they're very large at the beginning, they slowly turn into smaller arteries, like referred to as arterioles, which then are the ones that feed and they control actually the amount of blood being fed into capillaries. Capillaries is where the exchange of the material, whether it's gas or nutrients and so on, takes place. And then from the capillaries, the blood is also drawn again. It's a closed system, not perfectly closed, you'll see when we talk about the lymphatic system. The blood is recollected here through venules, which then discharge into larger vessels, veins, which then brings the blood back to the heart. So, based on their function, you can see there are differences between arteries and veins, arteries, arterioles, capillaries, and veins. So, starting with arteries. Arteries are taking the blood away from the heart. So, they're taking blood at very high pressure. Their structure reflects this. In fact, they're very large vessels with a very thick wall here, which is divided into three regions, referred both all as a tunica. So the inner part, the one towards the lumen, so the inside of the artery, is referred to as tunica intima. The one in the middle, tunica media, and then on the outside there is a tunica externa. The tunica intima basically is a layer of endothelium here and a small layer of collagen, which contains quite a bit of elastin. These vessels have to be fairly elastic overall. Then you have in the tunica media, you have basically smooth muscles. We rate this smooth muscle, so which is in control basically of the width of the lumen. Might contract, make it smaller, relax, make it a bit larger. And then on the outside, you have another layer of connective tissue, still fairly elastic with lots of elastin. You can imagine there is no exchange of material through arteries, and therefore they can afford to be that thick. Then the blood goes through smaller arteries called arterioles, which are thinner than this, with a similar structure but thinner than this, still no exchange. And then the blood gets into capillaries. Capillaries basically are nothing else than a single layer of endothelial cells. Okay, that's pretty much all that they have, and the amount of blood that goes through the capillaries is actually controlled at the arterial level. So the larger vessel before the capillaries. And we'll show you this picture is better. So these are the capillaries. So the arterioles here that feeds the capillaries, they do actually have structure here, which are called precapillary sphincters, which have a layer, circular layer of smooth muscles, which can contract or relax. When it contracts, it basically reduces the amount of blood going to the capillaries. So this will be the case here, very little blood. And when they relax, there is a lot of blood going through. Just to give you an example, for example, if you're very cold, you will be in a scenario like this. These sphincters would actually be closed up, or not completely closed up, but becoming much narrower, so very little blood will be going towards your skin, for example, here. The opposite, if it's very hot, you have more blood going through the capillaries in your skin, therefore more heat being released through your skin. Same thing applies with oxygen and other factors in there. So this is how capillaries look. Again, they're a single layer of endothelium, very thin, very narrow. They're so narrow that basically a single red blood cell can go through a capillary. The reason why they need to be so small is because basically this guarantees that these material here, so the cells will move very slow through these vessels. By moving very slow, the exchange of material outside and inside is maximized. The slower it goes, the more time there is for material to be exchanged. So gases, for example, oxygen to be released on the outside, carbon dioxide going in. The same thing for nutrients and so on. Now there are basically small gaps in endothelial cells which allow for the movement of small molecules like water, ions, nutrients, but not cells except for leukocytes, which are cells that are part of the immune systems. Now, these gaps can be larger, smaller, or non-existent. For example, in your brain, where you have what is called the brain-blood barrier, there is absolutely no gaps present there. You want to keep your brain very well separated from your blood system. They're much larger in liver, where the blood gets ultimately filtered and purified as well, and small intestine and bone marrow. So the size of these gaps can change greatly depending on the location of where the capillaries are. Then once the blood has gone through the capillaries, has to go back to the heart, and it does so through the veins. So first there will be smaller venules, and then there will be larger veins and so on. So at that point, you have to imagine the blood coming from the heart is progressively losing pressure. So the pressure that you have now at the capillary level is already quite lower compared to the pressure that you have right outside of the heart, so in the main arteries. And so for this reason, when you look at the structure of the veins, they have a much thinner wall overall. And now also, that's the reason why veins, they actually need some sort of help to bring ultimately the blood back to the heart. Imagine these are your veins in your legs. You wouldn't have enough pressure now for the blood to beat basically the gravity, which is drawing it downward. So the pressure is not enough, the one is left there. And for this reason, they get help through different things. Skeletal muscles, the contraction of skeletal muscle produce the pressure in these veins, increasing the pressure of the blood. And now to make sure that the blood goes in a single direction, so imagine your legs, the blood has to go only upwards towards your heart and not downward. They also have valves, which are unidirectional valves. Valves that then when the blood is going upward towards the heart, they're open, but when it goes backward, they close up, preventing the blood from flowing backward. Again, the movement now, the increasing pressure is coordinated by the work of these valves and the compression of the skeletal muscle present around the veins. Now, second part we talk about is how is the blood pressure controlled through the body. The blood pressure in the body has to be fairly stable, and obviously has to be also be able to adjust to different scenarios, such as major need of oxygen, increased temperature or stress, and so on. So ultimately, there are different factors that control that. Two things. Imagine the scenario, for example, you are drawing some water from a river and you are bringing it back to your cottage. What you will work with in order to make sure that you have enough pressure coming back of the water, you can work with two things. Sump pump, that will be the equivalent of your heart. So you want to increase the pressure, you can get sump pump, either a larger sump pump, so it has a larger volume coming out, or you can get a smaller sump pump to work more frequently, right? Second thing, the size of the pipes. You can play with the size of the pipes. If you have it larger, the pressure will go lower. Narrower, it will go higher. Same thing in your body. So your pressure is regulated by controlling two things. The cardiac output, the sump pump. Okay, so you can control how fast it goes, the heart rate, and also the overall strength. How hard does it contract? Same thing, you can control the volume or the width of the blood vessels. You can make them larger or smaller. Obviously, another factor that controls the pressure of the blood is also the amount of blood. If you have very little blood, your pressure will be much lower than if you have a higher amount of that. And now this is controlled. These factors are controlled by two main things. You have your nervous system, more specifically the autonomic nervous system that controls both the cardiac output and the constriction of the blood vessels, and the endocrine system as well. If you remember, we went through an example of a gland which under stress affects the overall heart rate and constriction of blood vessels. Now, what is controlling the cardiac output? There are different things. The main two things are the pressure of the blood and the oxygen level, which then have an effect on the rate and how strong the heart is controlled. In the next slide, we see how these two factors, pressure and oxygen, are detected in the blood vessels. But these basically, changes in this, activate the autonomic system, nervous system, by going through the brainstem. So signaling from different type of receptors will stimulate the brain system, which then through the autonomic nervous system could increase the rate and the force of the heartbeat. If you remember, stress response is stimulated usually through the sympathetic system, so that part of the autonomic system called the sympathetic system. And then if the detection of pressure or oxygen goes against, reduces the stimulation of the heart rate and the strength, in that case, that signal will be going through the parasympathetic system. How are changes in pressure and oxygen detected so that the cardiac output can be adjusted? It's through two types of receptors. Do you remember we talked about, when we were talking about the nervous system, the sensory nervous system, we talked about 5 different types of receptors that are present there. So some that detects heat, pressure, chemicals, and so on. So there are 2 types of receptors that do detect the pressure and the level of oxygen. So you have baroreceptors that do detect ultimately the stretching in the blood vessels. So they are embedded in the blood vessel, and what they do, so they can sense whether the blood vessel is dilating or is constricting. So if it's dilating, it means that there is a lot of pressure, right? So that will be interpreted by these receptors as a pressure that's getting too high, and this will stimulate through the brainstem. It will stimulate the slowing of the heart rate and the strength of the heartbeat. Through, obviously, in this case, slowing down will be go through the parasympathetic system. Chemoreceptor instead, in the blood vessels, they do detect oxygen level. And they do that, when they do that, so if there is high oxygen, obviously it means that, so if the oxygen, for example, is going low, so they detect low oxygen, in this point is that they will be stimulating the heart to pump faster and stronger, again in this case through the sympathetic system by going through the brainstem first. Now, pressure and oxygen particularly do regulate also the amount of blood going through. Sorry, before actually I get there, there's also an effect from the endocrine system that controls overall the strength, the cardiac output, and this is done in combination with the autonomic system. And if you remember when we talked about the adrenal medulla or the adrenal gland, there are two parts, the medulla and the cortex. In the medulla is that part of the gland that actually can increase the heartbeat rate and strength through the production of norepinephrine and epinephrine. And this will also at the same time will cause vasoconstriction of arterioles in different parts of the body, except for those involved in the stress response. So the heart, the skeletal muscle, and the lungs would not be sensitive to norepinephrine and epinephrine. So the cardiac output can be controlled by the autonomic system, depending on the level of pressure and oxygen, and also through the endocrine system, through the production of norepinephrine and epinephrine through the adrenal medulla. Now, changes in oxygen and carbon dioxide also have an effect not only in the cardiac output, but also in the dilation of the arterioles. Do you remember when we were talking about the arterioles, how they can control the amount of blood ultimately going into the capillaries? That's one of the mechanisms. So now there are chemoreceptors that do sense low oxygen and high carbon dioxide, and this causes the dilation of the arterial walls. The opposite, if there's higher oxygen and low carbon dioxide, these will cause the opposite effect. And this is mediated by release of nitrogen oxide, which has an effect ultimately on the endothelial cells. The smooth muscle in the arterioles before the capillaries. Now, the last thing we talk about here is the lymphatic system. One important thing to understand is that what we discussed in this lecture is a closed system, right? So where the blood is actually contained into a series of vessels. It's never really released in any cavities and so on. Liquor one thing to understand is that when the liquids are actually released by the capillaries, not all the liquid that's released, because of the problem with the pressure, not all the liquid that's released actually goes back into the venules and veins and back to the heart. So some liquid would tend to stay behind, left there. And that's the reason why sometimes you tend to have swelling in some part of your legs and so on. So there is another system that is connected through the circulatory system, which is the lymphatic system, that is in charge of two main things: is to collect this fluid, extra fluid, and also to present a pathway for many immune system cells to act and move around with that. So what does it consist with is, first of all, a series of lymphatic capillaries, which are basically embedded to the regular capillary here beside them. And then that's what they do. They actually do collect this excessive interstitial fluid that's left behind there. And now this fluid is brought back to the veins, not directly to the heart, but to the heart through the veins, through lymph vessels first, and then lymph ducts. So these are basically vessels of the lymphatic system that get larger and larger until this liquid is discharged into the veins. Now, how is this liquid collected here? Is through a series of flap valves, which then are activated by basically squeezing. So when there is high pressure, they open up, the liquid goes inside, and then when the pressure goes down, they close up, the liquid stays inside. And then, similarly to how the vein works, they use also the skeletal muscle pressure to actually move together with unidirectional valves here, similar exactly as in the vein. The pressure of the skeletal muscle and these unidirectional valves allow for the movement of this liquid in one direction, ultimately towards the vein, which then will bring it back to the heart. Now, the lymphatic system consists not only of these vessels here, lymphatic vessels, but consists of other things which are involved mostly, basically, in the immune system, filtration of the blood and immune system. And these are the lymph nodes, the spleen, the thymus, and the tonsils. So what they do, not only they bring all these debris and liquids, but also are in charge basically of detecting the foreign organism that enter our body and start the immune response directly there. We'll talk about that when we talk about the immune system. This is what we're talking about. So this is how the lymphatic system will look like in your body. As you can see, it's a series of vessels very well spread throughout the body, which have a series of lymph nodes. You can see here in these green dots you see here around the body. These are places where the blood gets filtered. They have lymphocytes in there, it gets filtered, and basically everything that's moving around your body, so viruses and bacteria, can be detected there and cause the activation of some cells part of the immune system. That's the reason why sometimes when you have an active infection, your lymph nodes would greatly grow, although they can enlarge themselves. Together with that, you have also the thymus here, which is located basically below your thyroid, right above, in between your lungs. Your lungs will be right here. And this is a place of maturation of other cells of your immune system, which are T cells. Together with that, also you have the spleen here, which is basically on the left side of your stomach. Your stomach will be right here. So on the left side, it's found there. It's, again, basically like a very large lymph node. It filters the blood as well. The same thing for your tonsils here that you have in your pharynx, right at the end of your mouth. Here you have your pharynx here. And here is, again, they're similar to, in function, similar to lymph nodes, and they do filter the blood as well. So in the end, as we said before, so you have also lymph nodes there. So they're found in different parts of your body here, and they're very rich on two types of cells, which are both involved in the immune system, in the activation of the immune system. You have macrophages, which are the first line of defense, the one that would ingest foreign objects like viruses and bacteria by endocytosis or phagocytosis, and they would destroy them, and then will present them to lymphocytes. This will result in the activation and the response against these organisms.